This is Keys to the Shop, episode 393, The Tyranny of Taste, with Kosta Kallivrousis. Well, hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Keys to the Shop, where we give you insights, inspiration, and the tools you need to grow as a coffee service professional. My name is Chris DiFirio. I'm your host for the show. Thanks a lot for tuning in today. Now, really quick, if you would subscribe to Keys to the Shop, you'll always be updated with new episodes as they come out. Just go ahead and hit subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And also, if you want to help the show out and spread the word about Keys to the Shop and the great content that these episodes provide, go ahead and share these episodes with your friends. Share it on social media. It's a great way to help the show grow and get these ideas out there into the industry. So thank you very much, everybody, for doing that. Now, Keys to the Shop is not just a podcast, but it's also a consulting and coaching company helping new entrepreneurs and existing coffee business owners build amazing cafes and coffee experiences for both their customers and their staff. And, in the process of running a coffee shop, it's easy to get overwhelmed with the daily operations, especially when you're juggling the operations themselves, the people, the quality of your coffee. And that's where Keys to the Shop Consulting comes in to offer you clarity and solutions and tools to truly thrive, whether you're just starting your first coffee bar or you've been operating your cafes but need some one-on-one coaching to take you to the next level. There's a lot of ways we can work together. I'd love to have a conversation and discuss it with you. All you need to do is email chris@keystotheshop.com. We'll set up a free discovery call and talk all about how Keys to the Shop Consulting can come alongside and help you build an amazing business. Again, that email for Keys to the Shop Consulting, chris@keystotheshop.com. Now, my main concern when it comes to going into a coffee bar is that not only am I going to get great service, but I have to get also great coffee, of course. I want something reliable. I want something that's a specialty experience, something that lives up to the hype that all of our marketing puts out there, that we say, come to our coffee bar and it will have an amazing coffee experience. And, sometimes people are let down, and part of that is maybe working with limiting equipment. Now, one of the things that has come out recently that allows us to break into new levels of quality and consistency is the ground control Cyclops brewer that comes from a company called Voga Coffee. Now, the ground control brewer uses SCA award-winning technology to unlock an incredible array of flavors in your coffee that in typical brewing technology can't really do for you. And that's what makes this so special. It really is a singular experience. And it's not just a new level of batch brewing quality, but it also makes batch iced lattes, batch cold brew, tea. So the extraction potential is off the charts, and that introduces new opportunities for profitability and efficiency. So go check them out over at groundcontrol.coffee to learn more about this amazing piece of equipment. And if you're looking for higher quality, better workflow, more profitability opportunities, this is the machine for you. I think you should consider putting one in your store. Again, check them out over at groundcontrol.coffee. One thing that's on my mind right now as I record this is that Coffee Fest is coming up, and that means there's a latte art competition to be had, which also includes a round where we do plant-based beverages. That's sponsored by today's sponsor of this episode, Pacific, and their Barista series. And I always enjoy seeing people pour with their products because I know that they're going to pour something really lovely. These products are created for baristas and tested by some of the best baristas in the world before you even use them on your bar. So the Barista series, as a line of plant-based performance beverages, stands up to the heat from steaming, produces amazing silky texture, again, for great latte art. But you would say, more importantly, this all creates a balanced beverage. So the focus is on the coffee. So this is a real winner in terms of what you use on your bar. Check them out at pacificfoodservice.com to get samples in your store and try it for yourself. If you're looking for the best plant-based beverages, then I think you should be using the Barista series from Pacific. Okay, everyone. Well, today is going to be a great conversation. I'm really excited about this one because I've been trying to get today's guest on the show for a little bit now because I've been talking with him as a friend in the industry about a bunch of different topics on and off at trade shows, through messages on Instagram. And it's been really fun. And I've always thought, boy, it'd be really good to talk about some of these things on the show. And finally, he's published something that it feels like a good opportunity to dive in on an official podcast. Today, we're talking with Kosta Kallivrousis, who lives in Kansas City and works at Ally Coffee as a senior account manager. And in his free time, he does a ton of research into coffee, community, and social movements, and is generally just a deep thinker who challenges the status quo of how the industry is run and who it's benefiting, and how we can create a better future for all players, especially those in the producing world. And today's conversation is all around an article that Kosta wrote for the most recent issue of Standard magazine. The article is entitled Against Taste and is really focused on the idea of taste making and quality and taste as a value that determines the worth of a coffee and whose coffee gets purchased and who is it that's determining the value of the coffee. Of course, the answer is most of us in the global north, in the consuming countries. So whether you are a cupper and Q grader, or you're just a barista working on the bar, a coffee shop owner just running your business, we are in the business of taste making. We determine the values of the market and whose coffee gets purchased and whose doesn't. And so downstream, this topic really does impact literal lives of people, both ours, but in especially intense ways, the producers. And so the conversation today is specifically around the idea that maybe it's time for us to take the value of taste and quality in that sense and have it take a back seat in some ways, and or put it into a context where there is more power given to those whose lives are more extremely impacted by it. And so there's a lot to unpack here, of course, because it's not just an open and shut case. We are, as far as we are in the industry, and we are beholden to certain systems. And so having these kind of deep conversations is necessary in order to create better ones going forward, ones that create more inclusion of those who have a stake in the outcome. And again, this is one of those things that inspires further conversation. We're not going to come up with some kind of a grand solution at the end, maybe some good ideas and some challenging ideas for you to chew on and continue to talk about with your team and your coworkers in the coffee industry. So I'm excited about this one. Really thrilled to have my friend Kosta on the show. So without further ado, let's get right into this. Here now is my conversation about the value of taste with Kosta Kallivrousis. All right, Kosta, welcome to Keys to the Shop. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I've truthfully been trying to get you on the show for quite a long time. So I'm really happy to finally make this happen.
I'm honestly just really happy that we're able to have a conversation. It's pretty neat that it's happening on the show.
Yeah, we've had lots of conversations, you and I, about, I would say, some more deeper things of coffee and the problems and the interconnected issues and stuff. So whether it's on the trade show floor or over direct messages on Instagram, it's really been enjoyable to kind of hear your thoughts on things. And in particular, I think this conversation is absolutely a must have. You've just written an article for Standard magazine called Against Taste. It deals with the subject of taste making and who gets to do it and the problem of competing values. There's a lot to unpack here. So I first want to just kind of ask you, what has gone into your opinions and kind of worldview about quality and taste that has inspired this particular writing, this article?
I would say, probably dealing with the contradiction of like growing up in the third wave or the specialty movement, and especially within competitions, like early as a barista and seeing narratives or rhetoric like how the producer is like first and foremost centered on stage, I would say like glamorized or glorified. Same thing with farms, things like that. There's a lot of like honor language that's used to growers' appreciation, and it almost becomes, I don't know, like godlike or relic. And then an experience of visiting a coffee producing country for the first time and feeling the juxtaposition between what the growers that I ended up meeting, what their livelihoods, aspirations, dreams, and goals were like, what I thought it would be like versus what the stage was telling me it would be like. And I wasn't able to reconcile the two.
What was it on that particular trip that really brought that juxtaposition home for you that made it enough of a contradiction that you couldn't escape it?
Yeah, I would say probably first and foremost, arriving, like it felt like I had arrived in like some type of paradise that I had been searching for, almost Garden of Eden, or paying some type of pilgrimage. Spent a few days on the farm. I had no agenda other than to just learn. I wasn't there on a buying trip. I was there on my own volition. And the producer wanted to go ahead and this was in Guatemala, and the producer wanted to go ahead and have his quality evaluated. And him, along with several other farmers, wanted to have their quality evaluated as well. I had no buying experience at the time, but I did have some like market indication as far as like where, price and quality were kind of intersecting at the moment. And so we ended up at a cupping lab in Barberena, Diana Cafe. And these are pretty well-to-do producers, medium to large, I think is how like they could scale. Some of them spoke English, some of them didn't. It was a fun atmosphere when we arrived. There was a lot of joking, fun. And then like as soon as the cupping started, like things became like really tense. It was me and a buddy cupping, and then the producers just standing on the outside. And like you could cut the tension with a knife, like in the air. You could feel the weight. We finished with the cupping. I go ahead and give the scores, and then they wanted market indication, of like what their coffees would sell for in the States. And that was something that I wasn't anticipating at the moment. And so I went ahead and gave them market indication, and it was drastically lower than what they had been anticipating, especially coffee would end up selling for. And then the next 2 hours was just, honestly, it's still very blurry for me, where I feel like I became the conduit towards their frustrations with the industry in its whole, frustrations towards the C market, towards, roasters, towards importers, towards cafes, towards consumers. And then the oddest thing started to happen that I didn't anticipate. And they would ask me, how much does a bag of coffee, sell for in the States? If we could sell this, roasted in the States. And I went ahead and told them, for like what their coffee was worth, probably anywhere between $14 and $18. And then you could see them dreaming about like selling roasted coffee in the States. And then they asked me, how much would a cup of coffee sell for? This was back in 2016, like the beginning of 2016. And I told them, I think at that time, anywhere between $2 and $3 for a cup of coffee. And you could see them like dreaming about opening up a cafe in the States. And all I could think is like, what is going on here? I had been dreaming about like coming to this place for, I don't know, 5 or 6 years, and they're dreaming of the opposite. And I realized like the world just felt so much bigger than what I thought it was, based in the little bubble of like specialty or third wave that I found myself in. And the issues that it experiences is so much larger than I thought it would. And the solutions, are so much smaller than the problems just in general. I mean, it was nothing but like just completely shattering my worldview, like that trip. I consider it a gift, to be honest. I don't know if I would have gotten that experience if it was a buying trip. I fear it might have been romanticized, and I feel like I got to peek behind the curtain, if that makes sense.
So your worldview was expanded. Maybe as it expanded, it shattered, and now you've got to reassemble it. And where it is you fit and making sense of it because you've seen the other side of things and the struggles that the producers are going through in their emotions and their business and their farming. What is it that you would say you've arrived at now over these last 6, 7 years later? You've got a different worldview based partly on that catalyst of that trip.
I don't know if I would describe it as an arriving because it still feels like a process to me. I would probably describe this as like my current opinion, and it's definitely open to being shifted, especially after having one that felt so solidified and untouchable. To have it rocked, I try to leave open a level of skepticism towards myself and my opinions these days. Where I would say like I'm currently at is that like market access solutions or the way that we try to solve things like pricing, for example, by, making it easier for coffees to get to market and be valued the way that we would like it to be valued is not enough. Probably my favorite example of like what happens with market access solutions is from Dr. Janina Grabs. She's a global value chain scholar, and she did a Rico talk, and she has this analogy of specialty coffee and just the coffee industry itself as a theater, and the theater catches on fire. Everyone rushes to get up and to leave, but the entrance is the exit. And so the people that are closest to the exit are able to escape, kind of unscathed, or, it's a lot easier. But as more people rush to get up and to leave, it becomes congested. And then, the people that are further back are the most likely to be harmed. In the same way, specialty coffee or third wave or verified coffee, as those that are closest to the exit are likely to be like first adopters. These are probably growers that, speak English. They have social capital in order to interact with buyers. They understand what buyers are looking for. They probably have financial capital as well. And so it's a lot easier for them to navigate a new market, exit, the burning theater that could just be the coffee industry itself. And then those that attempt to adopt those practices, it becomes a lot harder for them to reach buyers or to, make the type of impact that they would like on their lives. Just because there's just an oversupply of like coffee on the market, and there's an oversupply of really good coffee on the market as well. So I think there's an issue when we attempt to just look at the coffee trade as like an issue of market access solution. And I feel like that's kind of like what specialty is built on. If you create the right product, if you create the right image, if you understand what buyers are looking for, you'll be rewarded accordingly. And all too often, what I end up seeing is there's just a lot of really, really, really good coffee in the market that just doesn't make it because there's just not enough buyers. And so at that point, like producers end up getting pit against producers and they end up driving their own costs down. And then when those coffees don't get sold, then they just end up with like some of the largest companies on the planet at a dime for what they would have paid, if there were enough buyers available. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to bring it back to this article that you wrote and how taste making and quote unquote quality assessments, such as what you did at that trip in 2016, that kind of thing spread across the industry. That seems to be the crux of the issue here, where the market is based on these evaluations and based on taste making. So, what is it that, this is where I feel like I would love to hear a little bit more of your thinking on why you wrote this article. How does this link to what you were just describing? And how does taste making feed into the larger problem?
Yeah. So I think this like fundamentally boils down to who gets to make decisions at the end of the day. And typically what that means is like it's people, that are in the global north or just like the northern hemisphere, who come to the global south, tell growers, what they're looking for, and will pay accordingly to like what they end up valuing. a lot of times that doesn't take into consideration, the way that a grower might value their product, but it also probably doesn't take into consideration like what quality is. And I'm expanding the definition of quality beyond like what's in the cup per se. Like the quality of someone's life, for example, the quality of land. Like those things I think like fundamentally matter a lot of times more than like what specific like cup profiles or flavor profiles are found within a coffee. And I mean, the issue that I see at the moment is like growers simply don't have the ability to help co create or dictate their lives in the same way that people in the global north do for themselves, but also then like dictating it onto other people. So when I think about like taste, and especially like something as just like flat out convoluted as taste, I think we would like to think of it as objective. It is extremely hard for me to see it as that now. Probably one of my favorite examples is from a dear friend. She just finished her PhD in volatile compound studies, but she uses this example of, when you're tasting coffee and you're like, is this flavor cherry or almond? And the volatile compound is the same for cherry and almond. So when a person is tasting it, like the only difference is not the coffee itself, but the people who are experiencing it. And so that volatile compound will express itself differently to different people. And if that's the case, then we have not only an issue of calibration, but ultimately an issue of decision making and who gets to make the decision what something is. And within specialty coffee, if a coffee is labeled almond or having the flavor of almond, like it gets valued significantly less than if it has like cherry, for example. And so to me, that is like a fundamental issue. If we attempt to rely on taste and try to create standards on taste, when taste is like inherently subjective, and we can come to consensus making, I have no issues with that whatsoever, what something tastes like or doesn't taste like. The issue that I have is that like the vast, vast, vast majority of the time, the grower doesn't have the ability to sway a buyer as far as like something tastes, or even if a taste is more enjoyable to them. I've experienced events where, a grower is working on experimental processing, lays out like several different fruits experiments and maybe some like spices and things like that. And the buyers are talking about like what they enjoyed in the coffee, and it hit me in that moment that like no one is asking, this producer like what he enjoyed or which process he enjoyed the most. He ended up enjoying the spice process, which was kind of like this anise cinnamon nutty type of feel. And I can almost guarantee that no one ended up jumping up and down and being like, this is the superior coffee, or I want this coffee because he liked it the most.
Let me offer some pushback to that and deepen this a little bit and maybe confuse it a little bit more. The idea of asking, for instance, a farmer what their favorite is. And let's say that if you decided, hey, from now on, we're just going to ask the farmer what their favorite is, and then we're going to buy it and we're going to sell it. It doesn't seem like that would work because you're still dealing with market realities that you are going to have to be subject to as a buyer, because a buyer buys coffee to sell to people who have opinions about what they like and don't like, not even within specialty coffee. So just people who are buying grocery store coffee, or generally the way tastes have been created. I mean, we're so far down the line here that you couldn't just switch, and it may or may not be the moral choice, given the idea that down the line it might not turn out to sell more coffee. It might actually render people's opinion about that coffee worse than it was previously, even though you were trying to do the right thing by involving that taste making a little bit more on the farmer side.
Yeah.
How do you start to create that more equitable solution without completely submarining the whole thing in the process?
Yeah. So I'm gonna try to take this in two ways. I think I understand exactly what you're saying. Like people like what they like, and there's a subjective experience to that. People have agency. And when I'm talking about tastemakers and them deciding what they like and then bringing it to market, I don't want to ignore that like like people's tastes do change, and from different cultures, like they could, they can be different. People can like what they like. With that said, like I think there's a certain amount of I don't like this word, but I'm going to use it anyways in this moment. Like there's a certain amount of privilege that a buyer or a roaster or a cafe has within like the social context. I'm just going to speak on behalf of like the US. Like a lot of times, I think when a customer comes in, they're not necessarily looking, into a specialty cafe. They're not necessarily looking for like what they like per se. A lot of times they're probably looking to the barista or to that brand, to communicate to them what is good. And certainly people's values, I think people are driven by their values. And so like they're trying to find brands or places that like align with their values. And I do think there's a dialogue that ends up happening between like the consumer and the barista, for example, as far as like what's good and what isn't good. That subjective experience I don't necessarily like want to dissuade, and certainly there are times where a coffee just doesn't resonate with like a large enough swath of people, and then it doesn't get valued properly, and then it just like ends up either going past crop, or you just have to go ahead and get rid of that coffee. But I think a lot of the times, like what is considered specialty today was considered defective 20 years ago, and that's something that I can't ignore, and it's really 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 hard for me to do. And I think it's honestly because like we as humans, just like we shift with things, we shift with trends and what matters and what doesn't matter. And at the moment, we're saying fruity coffees matter. 30 years ago, like they were considered defective and they would never make it to market and they would get undervalued. And I don't think anything's like fundamentally changed with like human biology for that to happen, or like all of a sudden like we had this epiphany, like this objective epiphany of like fruity coffees are superior to all other coffees. I really think it like comes down to like a few people who are able to basically use like their social or cultural capital, say like this is better, and then using metrics to demonstrate, why they think it is better, and people wanting to emulate that. Like I think there's a lot of like performative aspects when it comes to quality. To me, like quality isn't something that's inherently found in something, it's a performance. I think that performance matters. And then the other aspect I think that you were talking about is like how to ensure that like something is equitably realized or valued. And to me that probably deals a little more with maybe like the political economy of things. Probably the best example that I've read was before 2012 and how EU dealt with wine. Wine, I think now is like valued at like 40 billion euros annually. And there's about $1.5 billion in subsidies that are given to growers in order to manage like surplus. And so like those subsidies kick in at like different levels in order to basically just continue to maintain a high price for their wines. And it's wine in the EU, from what I understand, like is, and anyone can correct me if they understand this better, please, I beg of you, has like two categories. One is bulk wines, and then the other is like basically like denomination of origin or like quality wines. Both are subjected to basically like a limiting of like how much can be grown or produced in order to keep prices maintained at the level that they are. But for whatever reason, let's say consumption ends up slowing down or something else ends up happening. The first subsidy that ends up kicking in is public storage. And so wines will, bottles will go ahead and be removed from the market for 2 weeks or so, wait to see if prices rebound. If they don't, then it's distilled into like vinegar, or I think cognac sometimes, or like some, you know, I think you understand what I'm saying there. And then if prices still don't rebound, then vines are ripped up in order to ensure that that doesn't happen in the future. And that's something that the industry, I think, within coffee is like missing. It had it for, from 62 to 89, but ended up abandoning that process for another type of political project in my mind.
Right. And that's European. And I'm not sure if you know exactly if that refers to also like Chilean and Argentinian wine. And
No, no, it's just EU wine.
right, right. Okay.
Yep. Yeah, just EU wine.
The solution itself is also kind of like a global north solution that they could probably do because of their infrastructure that may or may not translate across to other countries of origin for wine.
Yeah, I mean, but if everyone was in agreement, I think it could. Like that's basically what the International Coffee Agreement was an agreement between like countries in the north and countries in the south coming together, realizing that like if pricing continued the way that it would, like it would lead to catastrophic like societal failure because of the dependency on coffee for so many countries in the global south. So they ended up coming together, creating a quota system, basically just limiting the amount of coffee that would end up going onto the market. Later, it became a little more sophisticated with a price band. And so coffee had to be kept between $1.20 and $1.40 during that time. If it got below $1.20, then coffee would be restricted from the market. If it got above, then more coffee would end up on the market. But basically, this was just to ensure that like there was stability in the marketplace. And there are other commodities that do this. It's just simply that like in 1989 there was an abandonment of like this type of like political process and trying out a new political process, which I would probably like call like a market access agenda. Those aren't my words. That's from another scholar.
So I guess a question here would be that we both know that producers are not a monolith, and that in a conversation like this, it's just kind of assuming that everyone doesn't like the market as it exists now. And no doubt it can be improved, but there are people who within this market whose lives as farmers have been improved or don't have necessarily a problem with the market as it exists because they've built and invested so much into their infrastructure around it, around the way that taste making happens right now, and wouldn't necessarily say, you know, we want to determine what is valuable according to our opinions so that, we have a seat at the table. They're just saying, well, what do you want? And we'll grow it. And they're okay with that. How do you manage creating change in an industry where there's that kind of complexity? There's people that are okay within the system, and then there are people that are not okay within the system. I hope that makes sense. I'm trying to flesh out.
Yeah, I think it does. I think it does. Yeah, and just reflecting on like, thinking about like, I don't know, like governments and things like that. Like I don't want to advocate for paternalism. There's been enough of that in history. And I think the big thing is like a sense of like co-creating. Can growers and can, people that are coffee professionals and consumers, can they co-create something that they want to see together? And certainly there's the difficulty of, trying to translate values from different societies as far as like what they want. Clearly, I think like one of the values in especially coffee and third wave is around the idea of craft or craftsmanship. That's not always the case in growing communities when it comes to something like coffee. Maybe like with other things, but the obsession with trying to make coffee into a craft sometimes I feel like is almost like an exporting of American values onto other communities and expecting them to emulate it right back to them. And I think that's what bothers me, is the fact that a lot of times producers are price takers, but not only that, like they don't get to set the standards as far as, like what coffee means to them, what it means to their communities, what it means to their families. And for those that have been able to profit, make a livelihood and enjoy, the craftsmanship that can be coffee, like I don't want to hold anyone back from that either or advocate, that like everything just has to be like a monolith in itself. Certainly when I was talking about the wine example, like there's a space for nicer wines or maybe different types of wines, I should say. But that's also there's a limitation to I feel like there's a realization that there's a limitation to that market. There's a limitation to who that's going to resonate with, who it isn't going to resonate with. And so it isn't this free for all as far as like everyone trying to jump in and replicate it. Especially cuz like I mean those are where larger margins are made. And so I feel like there just has to be like a certain level of dignity that's given to a product, whether it's bulk or whether it's like this craftsmanship. And for those that have, you know, thinking of like specialty coffee, it absolutely has definitely benefited producers that are able to access that market. No question about it. I think the specialty coffee transaction guide, and people out there can call me out if I'm wrong with this quote. I think like the return to origin, basically meaning like, I believe it's the FOB price compared to the retail price of coffee is at 20%. And so return to origin roughly has been, I think on average, right around 20% for specialty coffee for those that have been able to donate to that project. And then the Coffee Barometer report has reported that like overall, the value of returning origin to producing countries is around 10%. And so specialty coffee is doing twice, that. And that sounds pretty good. But if we look back at like the International Coffee Agreement in 1962 and 89, like the return to origin was anywhere between 35 and 50%. And I'm basing this off of work of a political scientist, John Talbot. And that was for all coffee. And so I think the thing that I'm having a hard time reconciling within specialty coffee, or at least this proclamation that like it's going to be, this type of antidote for what the market is that, it's doubling overall, what producing countries are bringing home, but only for a very, very, very tiny swath of people. And when I compare it with, for example, like an international agreement in the past, that was doing anywhere between 35 and 50%, it's really hard for me to advocate, or feel like I want to stand behind something, as far as like trying to champion like specialty coffee will save the world.
Sure. And how does taste making shifting away as a primary value or quality and taste of coffee as a primary value create a different result similar to that return of 50% obviously was a governmental byproduct. And it wasn't because people were less likely to, or maybe it was that people were less likely to seek out particular kinds of coffees. But I feel like coffee earlier and earlier in its history was more exploitative, maybe. And so it seems like people would have, a little bit more likely to say, this is exactly what we're looking for and screw you if you don't have it. Back in the day, not that that doesn't happen now, but the question is, by removing taste as a primary value, how does that substantially shift the industry toward higher returns for farmers? Just because it feels like you're still going to have people who are going to acquiesce to what the industry wants based on just the numbers, not just conversations and saying, well, it's just like, this is what people are buying. They're in tune with that. And they're saying, well, we want to produce what people buy. And so it's almost like you can't get away from it.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's like a fundamental question of like, do we make the market or does the market make us? I do think there's kind of this like back and forth that happens between those that produce coffee, and I would also I'd probably put like roasters in that place too, and consumers. But ultimately, I think we end up making the market, those that have financial and cultural capital to basically dictate like what it's going to end up doing and what it isn't going to end up doing. And at the end of the day, like this is a drug. And at least for Americans, we're completely addicted. Like we need it. There's a reason that there's only so much decaf coffee that's on the market. And there's a reason why there's only so much like specialty decaf on the market too. It's hard for me to like take away the aspect of like, coffee being probably, it's a utility for like most people's lives. And then for a few, it tends to be a little more about like social or cultural capital that they're able to flex on, you know, people that aren't part of like their same like social status, or to like basically posture of like, look what I have.
Isn't that also true of farmers? The utilitarian, it's a commodity, and that for them, it's, just like us, we drink it as a commodity, it's a drug. But as a cash crop, it's also true that a lot of producing countries don't even drink the coffee. It's still utilitarian. It feels like there's two groups of people that are treating it as this commodity, this utilitarian thing that don't want it for the social status. They don't want the special. They just want it to work.
Yeah, I think I'll go ahead and talk about the example that like this contrast between like quality versus solidarity that anthropologist Ted Fisher ended up writing about in an essay, or excuse me, an article, and then ended up making a book on it. He's been working in Guatemala, I think, for like the past 20 years or so, specifically with like indigenous communities in the highlands. And with the rise of third wave in particular, like what's been happening is like this singling out of like the unique in particular in the singular. And typically what that's meant is like going into a community, trying to identify like the best coffee, typically from one producer, and then rewarding it, you know, four times as much as, let's say, the cooperative that they find themselves a part of. And then this puts a producer in a predicament where they feel, at least from his reporting, you know, they feel this alignment towards like wanting to be part of the cooperative and wanting to participate in the cooperative, but then the fiduciary responsibility towards their families. And like, just because of the way that something tastes, and maybe buyers not understanding that like producers do value being part of a cooperative, you know, they definitely want to make more money, but then it puts them in competition within themselves. You know, like, do they stay, you know, part of something that they socially value, or, you know, do they take the money and go? And a lot of times like producers end up like taking the money, because like how can you blame them, especially as they're trying to provide for their families. Like, it's hard for me to knock anyone to do that. I think just sometimes maybe with this idea of taste, you know, when we make taste like the superior value to everything else, when it comes to things like maybe the way that someone values, you know, working within a cooperative, or even like producing organic coffee, like those things at times are going to end up competing against one another. And then basically the value that matters the most is going to end up winning. And a lot of times, I think with especially, but third wave in particular, like the value of taste gets put above just everything else.
And we can use taste as a vehicle for promoting the more holistic view of what a successful transaction would look like, in that it brings about more quality of life without risking the market rejecting it, because we've invented the tight tolerances. And kind of imagined if it's not as peachy in the taste as we want it to be, that people are just going to, storm our cafes with angry torch bearing customers. There's more wiggle room in taste to welcome in a greater number of coffees. But it feels like what you've described earlier as this performance and the superiority and the singular, it is definitely centering us, and it's making our coffee sell, and we're saying, see, it's selling, right? And see, it's winning. And that is end of conversation. So it's very much not a nuanced conversation. And so we just get more of what we've got because of that, and leave people in the dust. So it feels like this is a both and situation. It's not like you're not going to evaluate taste, because you have to, because that's what coffee is. It's a product that you consume, right? So you have to involve taste at some level. So I guess it's just a question of how we can evolve taste to serve a greater purpose without sacrificing quality, in that, oh, I have pride in my work, and I know a farmer will have pride in their work. Craftsmanship is, I think, a human thing. We take pride in what we create in our homes, in our communities, in our work. So, how do we use taste to honor those things and be a servant of those things in specialty coffee?
That's a good question. I think it's one that we're all trying to figure out here. Maybe as we're just talking about it, you know, I don't want to completely knock like that taste doesn't matter. I just think it's more of like it's a realigning of values that's probably needed. And fundamentally, you know, like who gets to make those decisions at the end of the day? And I think it's my desire, at least, to see more of a co-creation versus a type of report that's given back to a producer. for like what their hard work, is worth. And also probably an expanding of what quality means. And certainly that goes beyond like what's in the cup. The quality and the dignity of someone's lives, to me is what matters like first and foremost. And like I just don't think that necessarily has to include flavors like bergamot or peach.
I want to ask you this because I think it's maybe on somebody's mind. And I'm going to take it to the extreme and say, are you saying that we should hope for a future where we're forcing people through our marketing to drink coffee that they kind of don't like because we're making them guilty and they're saying, well, it's for a good cause, so just suck it up?
I already feel like we do that. Like there are plenty of people who don't like peach or bergamot in their cups.
Ah, good point. Yes.
We're doing it already. Like
So our highest
it's
price
just we're
coffee
yeah,
are
go ahead.
the least liked in some cases. Well, it's true, yeah, because
Yeah,
you have people complain about the sourness of coffee. And you're like, "Psh, you don't
all
know."
the time, all the time. And then we act in a dogmatic fashion about it. Well, they just don't understand quality. But quality is also supposed to be objective, like it's gravity. But it also has to be taught. Like it's this giant walking contradiction that we continually try to negotiate and renegotiate within ourselves and in society. And that's where it just becomes like it just feels silly like at times, especially when we're talking about the dignity of people's lives, and we're arguing over like whether like, this sourness is enjoyable or not.
Right. And so when we're arguing over people's lives, it really comes down to also the idea of you as a roaster or you as a operator of a business. And for the most part, people listening to this particular podcast might be and probably are roasters or retailers of some fashion. You have a sphere of influence that touches the lives of very particular farmers. And you can listen to those individuals and those businesses and those organizations. And instead of giving them market access only, it's access to at least conversations with them and finding out where they stand. It may be that they're just like, listen, I don't want to make any decisions like that. Thank you for the offer, but we just want you to tell us what your customers want. And that's fine. You made that conversation happen with that one farmer. That's their decision. But you couldn't then just overlay that onto the next one because they might be like, you know what, we're really excited about that spice process coffee you mentioned earlier. Is there, can we figure out a way to like sell that? And so it feels like a case per case basis rather than creating a panacea for the industry.
To me, what I'm advocating for, honestly, is like trying to like advocate for like a practice of like everyday democracy and not necessarily like representative politics. It's the idea of seeing another human being and seeing their voice and not giving them, but like being able to listen to someone about like what they like and what they don't like, their wants, needs, and desires. And at the moment, like what I see within specialty coffee and the way that it's practiced is honestly something that's more authoritarian. Like there's a group of people who are going to tell you what they like and what they don't like, and then you can deal with it or you can walk away. And I think that's what needs to be fundamentally challenged. And it's just funny to me that like taste is this thing that's become like this almost like authoritarian practice in a way.
Yeah, in a sense, like the idea of taste would be authoritarian and it makes it sound very personal, like there's this a malicious intent behind it.
No, the indifference is what bothers me.
Sure. So indifference towards the end results is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of like this indifference bureaucratic system that like people end up like either subjecting others to, typically those that are trying to sell coffee. And either they have a passing or failing grade and that's it. There's no sense of, like it's why I'm trying to talk about like everyday democracy where people can come together, and try to work out with among themselves, like what matters and what doesn't matter.
There has to be a set of goals and standards that are applied within a transactional relationship at some point. It might be a bridge too far to call any standard or goal authoritarian. It's hard to say, like, okay, well, maybe the way this conversation has gone is we're talking about big taste, capital T taste in the world. But when you're working together with a farmer to help them, or they are working with you to sell their coffees, there definitely are cases where people have been able to improve their livelihoods, quality of life, and in turn, just objectively, the coffee got better. Because I do think that there's coffee that can be improved. And that's what they wanted. In a sense, yeah, that standard is an authority. I guess the difference is it agreed upon by the parties that we are participating in this? I'd almost hesitate to say for most people, no, because then it feels like I'm really demeaning their mental capacity. But for those who don't have a choice, who may want one, then it seems like it really resonates.
Yeah. And again, like I don't want to take away anyone's agency, or to say that we don't have agency or that producers don't have agency. They fundamentally do. We fundamentally do. I think how we practice that agency, like ultimately, is like what matters. Standards and goals matter. They matter to communities and they matter to like transnational communities. And like what ultimately matters is like, do we make those decisions together? Or do we just take the power within our own hands and decide like this is what's going to happen and this is what's not going to happen? And I think the practice of the way that taste is thought about today, like that's what I think like we've ended up, accidentally creating.
To end here, I think it would be good to ask the question, what can we do with our businesses and the influence that we have? We're serving our customers. Our customers have learned to appreciate coffees by communicating with us and us communicating with them. And if we want to make a difference in creating more of a conversation around taste with those whose coffees we roast and represent to the customer, how do we go about doing that? What are some good steps we can take?
Yeah. I mean, I think probably first and foremost is like when I think of specialty coffee and third wave, like the economic arrangement that I imagine it as is, in Ted Fisher's words, is a winner take all, is that the best is going to rise to the top. And that's what you have to choose at the end of the day. And that I think is what needs to be fundamentally challenged. The other value I would say is probably commitment or solidarity. And to me, I think what makes the biggest impact is the ability to basically commit to a grower or a growing community and buying their coffees year in, year out, almost no matter how it ends up tasting, specifically because like we're finding ourselves in a political and economic arrangement that fundamentally does not value coffee, the vast, vast, vast majority of coffee. And those that are able to get market access, not switching from one producer or producing group, year after year, makes a massive difference, especially because like there's just more producers that are running to like especially coffee and third wave in order to basically escape the way that the coffee industry is acting within itself. I think that's something that needs to be communicated to consumers as well, that this act of commitment can also be an act of solidarity, that things are not right here in the coffee industry. But it also doesn't mean that like people are playing like a complicit act at the same time. And I do want to, advocate or try to emphasize that people do have agency in what they do. And also just making space for producers and growing groups to be able to speak for themselves and what they like without the threat of, having their money or their livelihoods taken away. They should be able to speak freely and we should be able to listen to them, what they value and what they don't value.
Well said. Well, this is a challenging topic. I'm sure that we are only one tenth of the kind of conversation we could have about this were this just a 10-hour episode. But here we are. And I feel like we've gotten enough in the conversation to really get us thinking and hopefully go out and read your article on this in the other materials that you used as source materials for this. I'm sure are also invaluable to build your mindset around this topic. So, Kosta, I really appreciate you being on the show. And I tell you, this is why I like talking to you, getting in the weeds with some of this stuff. How can we learn more about what you write about, where you are on the internet and all that?
Yeah, sure. Probably Instagram is the best place to reach out to me. Espresso Patronus is my Instagram handle. You can also find me on LinkedIn. Kosta Kallivrousis should be it. Those are probably the two ways to find me. And also, like this is to me like, I mean, they're my opinions, but I also just feel like ultimately it's a dialogue. And it's a dialogue that I just want to continue within myself and continue with other people. And like I can't thank you enough for making space to listen to me, but also like, man, is it fun to talk with you. I really enjoy your pushback. Just feels like, I don't know, kind of like working out and negotiating and renegotiating my own ideas and like we're creating something together.
Totally a pleasure. Thank you, Kosta.
I appreciate it.
Okay, everybody. Well, I hope that you enjoyed that conversation. And I do hope that it challenged you as there was this give and take and some pushback offered by myself and some, challenging thoughts that Costa is giving us around what we commonly understand as being just the way that we judge coffee. And just it is what it is. That's the whole point here is to look intently at what we accept and determine if we can do better. And I do believe that we can do better. The question is, what are the next steps and how do we reformat our understanding of the value of a coffee in a broader context than simply a narrow range of taste and very specific flavor notes and things like that? Right now, it's pretty obvious that the industry relies on tastemakers in literal performance venues like competitions to have this trickle down impact on roasteries and then importers, exporters, and then finally farmers. Of course, we don't get to see that impact. And so we feel like it's just no skin off of our nose, really. But as you can hear from this conversation, and as you dig into this a little bit more, you see that it's not actually as easy as that, and the results of what you might find actually become rather distasteful. And so it is a conversation worth having. I encourage you to go to the most recent issue of Standart magazine and read this great article by Kosta and let this begin a great conversation with you and your team. A huge thank you to Kosta for joining me on the show and sharing these thoughts and really challenging us collectively in such a thoughtful way. If you want to keep up with all that Kosta is doing, you can just follow him on Instagram. The handle there is espresso_Patronus. And you can find that link in the show notes as well. And so if you have any questions, comments, or feedback about today's episode, any additional thoughts to this conversation about the tyranny of taste, if you will, then please do email me. Chris@keystotheshop.com is where you can do that. And that's also where you can reach out if you're interested in Keys to the Shop consulting and working with me one-on-one to help you build an amazing coffee business. Go ahead and email Chris@keystotheshop.com. Now, speaking of conversations and the impact of having a robust dialogue around topics concerning the lives of people in the coffee industry, that usually happens when you get together with other coffee people. And a great place to do that is at Coffee Fest. Coffee Fest has been going on for 3 decades now and is a hub for resourcing and equipping you and your team to run a great coffee shop through free or accessibly priced trainings, workshops, seminars, panel discussions, all designed to equip you do better with your finances, with management, with leadership, with barista training and coffee tasting. You name it. It's a wide spectrum of different topics and subjects that will help equip you for success. On top of that, there is the show floor where you get to interact with vendors from all different kinds of products and services. And you have the community as well. Like I mentioned, that you get to meet tons of people that are like-minded in their pursuit of coffee excellence. Check them out over at coffeefest.com. Use the code KEYS, KEYS, to get 50% off your registration today. Use the code KEYS again to get 50% off your registration. I'm going to be at all these shows. I really hope to see you there. So if you see me, I'll be judging latte art. I'm giving 5 talks over the course of the 3 days coming up. This next show is in New York City, followed by Louisville, Kentucky, and then there's Orlando, Florida, and Anaheim, California. It's actually Anaheim first and then Orlando. But you can find all that out over at coffeefest.com. So again, check them out. I hope to see you there, coffeefest.com. And with that, that is the end of our show, everybody. Thank you so much for taking time to listen and to share. Subscribe to the show. It means so much to me. We're just continuing, going strong in 2023, year 6 of this podcast. Couldn't do it without you. Thank you again. And as always, I hope that today's episode has truly given you keys to the shop.